So what we're going to be talking in this panel is the role of the private sector in trying to help make the economy rebound. What we know is that the Iranian government has a target, it has an annual target of 8% on average in terms of economic growth, and this is up to 2020. And according to estimates for 2016, if we're positive, the growth rate won't be more than 4.5%. So it's quite far from the figure that's being envisaged. And what we'd like to discuss here is what can the private sector do to help, to help the growth that's being taken into account, and mostly, how can the private sector contribute, but also what the business leaders that are inside the country and have been operating out of Iran for a number of years, and also those who have been overseeing business with Iran, what can their role be, and what type of concrete advice they want, they can offer for people who are looking to enter Iran sometime soon. So I have here with me a lady who has 15 years experience from the nexus of foreign affairs, business development, and entrepreneurship. She specializes in private sector development and policy advocacy and has worked in the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and East Asia. She's a driving force for the International Council of Swedish Industry, which is a non-profit organization that supports sustainable business in complex environments. And it represents many of Sweden's multinational companies. She has headed Iran's portfolio for the council, so also known as NIR in Sweden, for about a decade, and she's been advising member companies on the market. So I have here with me Sofia Svingby. Our other speaker is, I'll keep his name for later. He's worked in the food distribution sector in the United States until 1990, before returning to Iran and establishing 2 food manufacturing companies and also a food distribution company. The Alizad Group specializes in fruit juice concentrates, beverage and confectionery products, and it controls some of Iran's leading food brands, including Sunich, the fruit juice. And for anyone who's been to Iran and has opened a fridge in Iran, I think you've definitely seen a Sunich fruit juice. So as the chairman, Fardin Alizad oversees an organization that today counts more than 3,000 employees. Fardin Alizad is our second speaker. And we also have here with us today an entrepreneur and investor in Iran with a strong investment track record in the Iranian market and reach into the business community. He operates off 3 different platforms. He's the founding partner of ACL, which is an investment firm focused on Iran. He's a director of Aria Diesel, which is an exclusive dealer of Renault trucks heavy range in Iran. And he's also the director of Maadiran Group, which is a leading IT company in Iran. Ali Amiri is our third speaker. And last but not least, we have the founder and CEO of Cobel Darou, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in Iran, with 10% market share in pharma products. As the CEO for the past decade, he's built a strong relationship with global brands, including Sanofi, Roche, and AstraZeneca. And Cobel Darou offers products across 12 therapeutic fields and employs over 1,500 people. Shokrollah Memarian also serves on the board of 5 other pharma companies. So if you could please join me in welcoming our 4 speakers for this panel. And what I'd like to do, first of all, is ask an opening question for all the panelists here on how can the private sector help the economy? And, each in your own experience, what would you say are the areas that are best placed to play a role? So if Sofia wants to get started on this one.
Thank you, Ladane. And let me just start by saying that economic growth for the primary part obviously comes from the private sector. So what is it that makes the private sector grow is part of what we need to look at to help economic growth. Having said that, obviously what the private sector can contribute is with job creation, employment, but also innovation and investment in capital, in technology, and in human resources. When we look at specific sectors where I see a particular opportunity, looking firstly, obviously, at oil and gas sectors because of their prominence in this economy, I think it's also interesting to look at automotive for its opportunity for job creation, but also technology transfer and regional expansion opportunities. ICT and services, again here for job opportunities, but also taking into consideration the large, very highly skilled and technology university students population. I'd like to throw in another sector here that was briefly mentioned, and that has to do with sustainability, environmental protection, when it comes to transportation, water management, waste management, and let's not forget renewable energies.
Yes, thank you. As you know, the private sector, like in Europe and in America, this is the real engine behind an economy. In economies like ours, sometimes it's lagging behind. The private sector being still very strong with its productivity in Iran, still constitutes a small portion of the economy. What's important for the government to do and for the private sector is to expand this section in Iran. The more you get individuals with innovation, with private investment, be it from Iran or from abroad, the more job creation you will get, the more dynamics you get in the economy. So that should be an objective. Then you have a lot of private sector Iranians who are abroad, which was mentioned before. They can take a look again back into Iran now that things are getting better and opening, and I think that will be very important. Also, I think the government will eventually look into privatization, real privatization of a lot of the government companies that do operate sometimes in a more inefficient way than private because there's bureaucracy in it, or they don't really do the same accounting type of profitability calculation as private sector does. And when this happens, and if it's done right, I think it's also a big opportunity for foreign investors back if they want to come into the country.
Sure. Ali?
Well, in terms of what the private sector can do to help the economy, it's inbred. Right now, there are some gaps that this inflection point that we've gone through is, there are some gaps that need to be filled. There's a capital gap, there's a knowledge gap, there's a credibility gap, and the subsector, the group that is best suited to bridge these gaps is the private sector. We've got people who straddle the earth and Iran. It mostly comes from our subgroup of Iranians, the private sector. We go by the ways of Adam Smith. We don't ask questions, we find pathways. I think this inflection point is coming our way. So it's by helping itself, the private sector will be helping the economy. It's always done that, not dissimilar to other places on earth. In terms of sectors that I was thinking about that, I would have to say infrastructure is the one that is the most interesting, the most valuable. Sadly, it was arrested. Its development had been significantly, unlike goods that flow physically well, like iPhones or consumer electronics, where I've got experience in huge equipment. You can't smuggle those things in, you know. And you don't have the caterpillars shoving earth around, you won't get the rail going, you won't get the road going, and if you don't have Boeings landing, you won't have the airports filled. We've got 80 airports inside our country. Turkey has 40. Ours are gathering dust because they have 1,300 air equipment. We have 400, half of which are downed and cannot function. So infrastructure, you know, road, rail, air. It also creates jobs. That our country needs to create jobs. Unlike oil and gas, which are capital intensive, infrastructure projects tend to be labor intensive. And you know, we've got a lot of brownfield projects laying around. You know, the Chinese equipment didn't work, it blew apart, the Indians didn't show up, you know, finance didn't come, so it's fresh. So when it moves, and the private sector can move it, it won't be moving by marginal magnitudes, but orders of magnitude, what that GDP growth of 8% is. So infrastructure would be my favorite.
Okay. But in our section, which is the healthcare, we are in the healthcare pharmaceutical sector in Iran. Unfortunately, private companies are only represent 30% of the total market. The rest of the market is controlled by semi-governmental and also governmental companies, and this has not changed a lot during the past years. I think what private sector could do in our industry, first of all, I have to say that the healthcare system in Iran is around 7% of the GDP, and pharma, I guess, is below 10%. What I think we could do in private sector is to invest as much as we can in production and distribution, which we have been doing in our company during the past 15 years in Iran. In pharma industry, which is very complicated industry, what we have to, in fact, persuade the European companies, European American companies, to come in Iran to invest in Iran in production, and also, as I mentioned, and also in distribution. Apart from this, I think our role in Iran in pharma section is to give the people the best solution for their health care. This is what we can do in Iran by investing and reinvesting. I think we could do this. Unfortunately, at the moment it's a bit difficult because Europeans and Americans are not really are not trying to come in Iran. But whenever they came to Iran, they have been successful. I could tell you that, for instance, in our organization, we little by little we persuaded Sanofi company to come to Iran and participate in the production of pharma products in Iran, and I can tell you that they are at the moment #1 in the industry. Mm-hmm. So this shows that if the pharma industry, pharmaceutical companies in Europe and in America, if they come and invest in Iran, I think they can be successful.
Right.
There are, I mean, later on I will come back to if I have time to let you know that what are the obstacles that preventing some of them to come to.
Well, actually, drawing on one of the points you mentioned, so talking about bringing investment inside the country, how can the private sector encourage that foreign investment, Fardin?
Well, foreign investment in Iran will have some challenges, for sure. If you want to have short-term returns, it's a bit difficult. You have to either find the right partner to do investments in the stock market. Hopefully you make some money. As the curves showed, there were swing on the stock market. Or the easiest is to put your money in the banks and you'll get the 20-25% interest, which is very, very high. I mean, I don't think the valuations are going to match it, at least in the next year or two. So these are really the easy and short term. Otherwise, you really have to look at Iran as a long term. There is no other way. Iran is opening up. There's a lot of noise about it. But one thing is for sure, it's opening up very slowly, and nobody wants it fast. Neither, I think, the private sector nor the government sector. In all aspects, if you look at it, it doesn't make sense to go too fast. Capacity-wise, infrastructure, education, HR, there's a lot of challenge there that needs to be resolved before moving forward in a faster pace. For a foreign investor to come into Iran and do the long-term investment, of course, they need to really select the right industry. There are some very good ones, I'm sure, like oil and gas, and there's a lot of good ones like the hotel industry, which is really short. The retail industry is a lot to be done. We are in the FMCG. In FMCG, we have some companies that are already established there, multinationals, global companies. The key to get involved in Iran is due to the complications that exist, be it bureaucracy or environment and so on, you really need to have the right advice, and this can be in the form of a good partner. Mm-hmm. Having a private sector as partner, I think if you do your homework right and you find the right partner, then you have a big chance of succeeding. And that partner can help you tackle the local issues, but you can also fall in a trap of not finding the right one, and then you may lose 5 years or more, and as we've seen with some of the big companies. But those that did come to Iran and got in line somehow with good partners, they were quite successful. Actually, during the sanctions.
During the sanctions.
I mean, this is a big economy, a big consumer, and they were sometimes even happy to be alone and operate alone. Now, with the opening, it may be some competition even for the foreign companies.
Yeah. So the importance of having a good partner. Can you think of other obstacles that, you mentioned some complications, bureaucracy, etc. Sofia, can you think of other obstacles that, have played into the decision of foreign companies?
I think I'll start by saying that not all foreign companies want to be investors in the first instance, but prefer to build relationships by trading. For sure, that is often the case with Swedish companies who I work with. But if we look at FDI's opportunities and challenges for FDIs, I think in the short term, what is a challenge is the uncertainty of the U.S. sanctions. Those are remaining. We can't deny that, and also the risk for snapback. Even though I would agree with other speakers that it's not a very big risk, but it is there on the short term. On the medium and longer term, I would say that the business environment is also a challenge, where multinational companies want to have a transparency, predictability, and stability, and perhaps less of presence of government and state in private sector. So I think that for the longer term, business environment reforms are what would be wished for, including a further privatization scheme.
Building on Sofia's points, I mean, definitely for sure, as FDI all over emerging Earth gets in there, it's first, government to government, then quasi-governments, and then government to private investments, like the International Finance Corporation, the World Bank. At the end of Mr. Khatami's administration, the IFC was in Iran, on the ground, looking for investments. And then those are the yardsticks that other private sector companies then, look at those cases and then come in or don't come in. So, we're resetting to that moment again. I always like to say we are re-emerging, we're not emerging. We've got a huge operational leverage to surge from. And in fact, proudly, I think we're a brick in waiting. And it's going to come faster than most people expect. His Excellency Ambassador Haas, correctly, I think, said, this is one of the fastest openings he's seen. And I say the same. Being on the ground, it's, going on a Lufthansa flight, Airbus 320, half full, and only Iranians, and last week, you're getting the 747-400s, and that's just the German lot, So, media has really, the perception of Iran has been formed by media. Sitting at the CIP looking at these people get off, I see loudspeakers that are going to talk to 20 people. And this group, at some point there's a critical mass that starts reforming the perceptions of Iran. That is very encouraging. But in the meantime, the US primary sanctions are in place. If there is one obstacle that makes a lot of foreigners to Iran, foreign investors to Iran, scratch their heads, is how to find the right pathways in the existing sanctions. Gladly, for us to have been and studied these things for bedtime reading for long enough, the pathways are clear. It's going to take folks a while to get comfortable with them, and I think we're going through a natural process. Most people I talk to, I consider experts, really think the next 6 months is going to be a discovery of pathways and then a resurgence, if I may emphasize, of Iran towards the BRIC economy.
So, Sofia, what would you say do companies need to keep in mind when they're looking at Iran? You mentioned looking at it over the long term. And so if you're looking at a long-term partnership, how do you go best by trying to install that, but at the same time, having a long-term vision, but at the same time being mindful of the local fabric of the place?
Well, I think firstly, we have to realize that Iran offers fantastic opportunities. There is a tendency that we talk a lot about challenges, but it's obviously, that's why we're here. It's fantastic opportunities. But it's also a very complex market if you're not from there. And I think that that is something that many people can attest to. Partly because there are both formal and informal structures and formal and informal authority layers that can be hard to decipher if you come as an outsider. I think that is one part of the complexity that you can see that gives you you have to have the long-term strategy. You have to have perseverance, and you have to be there for the long run. Not only to actually understand what are the actual complexities in order to analyze risk, to mitigate risk, and to harvest opportunities, but also, and this is the second really extreme important point, to establish relationships with local partners, with local people, to understand the culture. And having a good local partner, as has been said many times, I think is really key to get help to understanding these complexities and to see the opportunities. But you could also, I think, be aware that having more of a broader view on Iran is also a good business sense. That is, to show interest in the proud history of Iran, to know at least basics of Persian culture and poetry, for instance, is of course helpful. And because of relationships are so important, this will be helping you. It's also, you can find cultural differences sometimes that may be hard to get around. I think the polite culture of Darou, for instance, sometimes gives a bit of expectation management. And that is something that I think Westerns or European companies should look into. But coming back to the long-term issue here, I think what one needs to realize when looking at multinational companies is that their business is global. So sustainability issues will come at a very high place in their strategies. So what a multinational brand does in any market has a reflection on headquarter level and stakeholders both in that country and globally. So a leader for a multinational company must be not just the chief engineer, which has probably been in the past, but nowadays also chief diplomat and chief negotiator, in order to get that, not just the legal contract or license to operate, which obviously is a basic, you have to clear the legal hurdles to operate, but also to get the social license to operate. And that's also both global stakeholders, but also local stakeholders. So you need to be really aware of how you influence the environment where you operate, and also obviously be attentive to how the environment where you operate can influence you and your opportunity to operate sustainably. And then I mean sustainably in all three manners, obviously, environmentally, socially, and economically.
So I wanted to turn to you, Shokrollah. Iran has been ranked by the EIU as the 4th lowest when it comes to business environment. And what I want to know is, like, as a business leader, you know, how do you deal with you know, the argument that Iran is just too uncertain of a market to invest in or to operate in? How do you go about it? And, you know, what advice do you have for newcomers?
Well, I mean, if you look at Iran during the sanction, the reality is that the Iranian people suffered quite a lot, especially in the healthcare system, where we heard always that the pharma and the food industry is exempted from the sanction. But the reality was that because of the banking system that we had, we suffered a lot also in pharma industry as well. But nevertheless, we managed. Iranian managed to overcome these difficulties during the past 8 years. Look, I think, you know, today, last year, the year before, we were always talking about how we can enter into the Iranian business. I hope that next year it's not going to be the same session here. Maybe we all be in Iran. All these due diligence, you know, insurance, risk existed in Iran. How could a multinational company come to Iran without having a good evaluation of risk? But they did calculate the risk, they did measure, they did do the due diligence, and they came to Iran. I think now that the market is opened up for the private sectors and also for the European to enter in Iran, I think it's a very good opportunity to come to Iran. Obviously, there are obstacles. Obviously, I mean, you cannot go to any countries without having obstacles. Obstacles exist. The question is how you could solve these obstacles. Definitely, I'm going to talk to the European investors or to the European companies to come to Iran. If they want to come to Iran, look, be sure that you cannot come to Iran when everything is solved. It would never happen. It would never happen within, I can say, 20 years' time. But the obstacle in our sector, what I think the obstacles are the regulation. Unfortunately, in Iran, we do not have consistent regulations. The regulations in Iran are changing quite a lot, changing maybe every 3 months, 4 months. This is one of the obstacles that I see, which we have to push the different sections of the industry to solve this. The other issue is, I think, is credit issue that we have at the moment. And also, as everybody was mentioning, is the banking system. The previous panel, they were saying that Europeans are not afraid to come to Iran, but I think they are. I think they are afraid to come to Iran because they want to see what would happen. What would happen in the future? What would happen in the United States? Who's going to be elected in the United States? Who's going to be elected again in Iran? I fear that maybe after 4 years, we are still waiting to see who is going to be, after 8 years, to be elected in Iran. I think, in my opinion, all these issues that exist in Iran is manageable, definitely, is manageable, which has been managed to some extent in the past.
Okay. Fardin, do you have some thoughts on that, or should we move on to
Look, we've been in Iran working there for the last 25 years, for myself.
Right.
We went through a lot of hard days, full sanctions. We had solutions for them. Okay, we are locals, we know how to manage it. But today, the ingredients really are there. Everything is, the main ingredient being the bank transaction issue, which was stopping a lot of the foreign companies. We were able to manage it using local exchange offices very efficiently. We would call the person of trust, he would come, I mean, not even come, just we would agree on a certain price of currency. The transfer was there the next day abroad, and he would get paid any amount. During these years, I don't remember any exchange officer telling us there is not enough currency. So there was always a way to do it. Today, this obstacle is away now. The rest, besides the banking issue, the rest is just normal challenges which any businessman has anywhere in the world. You have HR issues, okay, so you have to go and tackle it. You have regulation problems, you have to go and use the right advice. There is no gain without risk and without without efforts to solve. And a good businessman should know where he wants to go, and Iran I think, is a good place to be, especially if you're looking at long term. And one other point of importance I should mention, being present locally, is we see a very strong improvement of attitude towards private sector from Iranian people and from the government officials. Wherever we go, be it the governor, be it the ministry, or where we go, as soon as they see it's a private sector coming in, and there is respect, and they try to help as much as possible. Maybe sometimes they just can't because the bureaucracy doesn't allow. You have to find your ways and address the problem. But their attitude is totally positive towards private investors, entrepreneurs, foreign investors, I would say even more. And they have the extra security of insurance, which is fully covering their investments in Iran. I don't think there is anything. Okay, full opening may take a little bit more time, and it will probably come once the relations really get normalized with all countries. But it's the time now is now, if you want to be a head starter as a good investor.
Right. So as a final question, Ali, what would you say is the role of a business leader if we move beyond the facts and figures and, you know, and economic growth, but looking at it, you know, in terms of also helping in that path, Iranians prosper and you know, and creating jobs, so looking at it also more from a social perspective. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, our country is going through a great period of change, positive change. It's, and at this, again, inflection point, I think as the world refines Iran, I think Iranians need to refine each other. I think socially, we're damaged. We've been through a very harsh half-decade. Iran is not uniform, and its social sets are not uniform, or they think they're not. We're far more uniform than we think we are as Iranians. If my generation's leadership has anything to do with it, it's to bring us all back together. If Iran is going to win against other economies in this inflection point, in this path that's laying ahead of us, I don't think any Iranian, outside or inside Iran, should feel left behind. This is a very loaded phrase, and for Iranians, it's a moment to pause and think who we are. And I entirely agree that the groundswell of positive getting together is there. As a business person, I can vouch that from Mr. Rafsanjani's administration through to Mr. Khatami's administration, through Mr. Ahmadinejad's administration and today's administration, if you are in line with government policy, you really get the goodwill of the government bureaucracy. Sometimes they might get it wrong, or we might get it wrong, but the goodwill is there. I can vouch for that. And if in our station as the private sector, we can bridge the public sector with the incoming investment sector, I sort of see our small community as the leaders in bridging many things together. The Iranians of different heritage around Earth to finding what beauty awaits them, and the knowledge that they will bring into, like all diasporas do. And we need to take some government skepticism, from the private sector away, saying that, we are on the same side of the table trying to create jobs for the next generation. And to the foreigners, we need to say, don't be scared. Trump can't be that bad. We've lived through worse. And then let's all build together. In fact, you don't demand change, you motivate change. And I think the private sector will be well placed to motivate that change. We're uniquely placed at this moment. Mm-hmm. It's great to have it.
Thank you. We don't have, unfortunately, that much time, but I do want to have, just to open it up for a couple questions. So, please. Wait. It's coming.
Yes, okay. My name is Livia Manzini. I represent a Turkish company, Bell Packaging Group. So we are active in packaging material for fast-moving consumer goods and pharmaceuticals. I'm a little bit confused about whether there is really pent-up demand in consumer products in Iran. This morning we heard that the consumer market should grow, but not that much. So if there is pent-up demand, the Iranian consumer is sophisticated, high level of education, and yet the forecast for growth of FMCG products doesn't seem to be so high. It should be several percentages more than the expected rate of growth of GDP, with the expansion of retail distribution, supermarkets, multiples, and so on. The experience in Turkey has been a little bit like that. So do you think there is a pent-up demand in consumer products, if FMCG products, and so and also in the quality of those products, or is the consumer usually well-serviced, satisfied, so the growth will be with the growth in population, incomes, and so on? Thank you.
Thank you. Adi, do you want to take
I mean, Friday can, well, both of us, I suppose, we've been long enough, but for my part, I would say that in fast consumer, from the consumer electronics business, I can tell you, and it won't be too different from the products that have, that travel easily, that trade easily, like smartphones or anything that carries across borders well. Iran is pretty saturated. We haven't been, where sanctions were not there, the hand of Adam Smith through smugglers and grey marketeers cleared the market. You can't smuggle in Caterpillars or, big Volvo trucks. So in relative terms, the consumer, fast-moving consumer goods sector, in relative terms, is more saturated, and so the growth in those sectors will be more incremental. For those, the opposite side of the physical size and value spectrum, like, I don't know, a washing machine that is less expensive than a smartphone, but 8 times its size, the smuggler doesn't take it into Iran. Those parts, the quality spectrum, Beko or Vestel or Arçelik in Turkey, they're better positions to capture that market through a hyped up quality or an increase in the quality drive. The local products aren't that. So there will be a growth on the basis of better quality. But, Marlboros exist in Iran. My favorite sector, infrastructure. That will have orders of magnitudes of growth because it's been arrested. It was sadly built for sanctions, if you, in a very morbid way. But so I hope that, I don't know.
Thank you, Adi. I'm sorry, we have to finish this panel here, and I'm sorry to cut you, Fardin, but I do urge you to reach out directly to this gentleman and this lady. They have a wealth of experience, and thank you for your comments, and thank you for the participation.